When you hear the Fed or the Federal Reserve, if you're like most people, you probably think it's a government entity, namely the government's bank that sets interest rates. The truth? It's not a federal agency at all. It's a private bank that steals money from the American people each and every day. And in this video, I'm going to explain how they do it. By the end, you're going to realize why Bitcoin is so powerful and probably be extremely angry. Hi, my name is Jeremy, and if you want to understand Bitcoin and blockchain technology, then subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so you don't miss a thing. And remember, none of this is intended to be financial advice. I'm merely a guy sitting in front of a computer talking to a camera. Let's get into it. So just a quick note, I'm not going to get into the details about the history of the Fed or its structure. I'm simply going to tell you how they steal your wealth by robbing you of purchasing power. Now, the Fed was founded in 1913 by an act of Congress. Our elected officials did this to us. The act basically allowed a private bank called the Federal Reserve to be created and gave it power to issue currency. In other words, the power to print money at will. Now, the only power the government has over the Fed is the president to appoint a Federal Reserve chairman every 6 years, which he can't even fire, by the way. So the US government gave some bankers the ability to create money out of thin air, then loan that money to elite member banks at extremely low interest rates. They then can loan to people at a much higher interest rate, pocketing the difference. And Congress gave them the power, and that's exactly what they do. So our current economy is built on debt, but it wasn't always that way. So we thrived as a nation for nearly 150 years before the Fed was created. We were a wealthy nation, but it was true wealth. Wealth was built on innovation and capital investment in true new technologies, not simply speculation in real estate and stocks. We actually had deflation. As technology grew, the cost of goods and services, food, housing went down in price because it decreased production costs. Not wealth built on debt. That means that if you saved $100 before the Fed, in 3 years, that same $100 would buy basically the same amount of apples, flour, or whatever else you wanted to buy. Today, if you save $100, well, within 3 years, that $100 might buy you $80 to $85 worth of stuff, if you're lucky. The reason? The Fed creates money out of thin air, by the way, we mentioned that earlier, but it then loans it to member banks. Those member banks have access to incredibly cheap money that they then loan to the people at a much higher rate. So in the end, that free money, and I mean that, it's free money to them, is now floating around the economy. More people buying the same amount of goods, supply and demand, the price of those goods go up. You still have $100, but it won't buy the same amount of things that it did just a few years ago. The banks get free money, the rich get richer, and the common man gets poorer. The whole reason that Social Security was created was because people could no longer simply save for retirement. They would lose all of their purchasing power to inflation. In order to succeed in the dollar system, it required you to speculate in other assets like stocks or real estate. So here's how it works. Now, we've all likely heard of the Fed funds rate. It's essentially the interest rate that the Fed loans to member banks. They're always, by the way, raising and lowering that rate to try to keep inflation at a certain amount. So let's say that the interest rate the Fed set is at 3.5%. Now, your neighbor goes to the bank to buy a car. The bank borrows the money from the Fed at 3.5%, money they didn't have. Then it loans your neighbor the money to buy the car at 10%. So they're essentially pocketing 6.5%. It's free money to the bank because they know they can always get a higher interest rate from the people because the people don't have access to the Fed's 3.5% money. The money did not exist before the Fed loaned it to your neighbor bank. Your neighbor's bank really doesn't care what the interest rate is because they're collecting a hefty premium and they didn't have the money to loan to them in the first place. Ford now got $60,000, a check for the car that they then used to buy car parts, pay employees, and keep the lights on. So that $60,000 now flows into the economy, and your purchasing power has dropped by a little bit. Multiply that by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of transactions, and you can see why your purchasing power drops. More money into the system for the same amount of goods and services. The rich get richer because they're playing with house money. Everyday people get poorer because their dollars don't go so far. So what happens then when your neighbor's bank makes a bunch of risky loans to your neighbor and a bunch of their other neighbors, and they just simply stop paying on those car notes? Now they can't pay the Fed back because they're not collecting that premium. So you would think they would go bankrupt and be punished for lending money to people who likely wouldn't pay it back. I mean, that's what would happen to everyday Americans, right? If you don't pay your car note, the car gets taken away and they may have to file for bankruptcy. That's not how it works with the elites. What do? Well, just look at the financial crisis of 2008. They go to Congress. Congress goes to the Fed says, okay, we think you're too big to fail. We'll go ahead and create more money out of thin air, and we're going to buy those bad debts back. So those debts that people aren't paying from, we'll pay you for them, and we'll just take them back. Doesn't matter to us. We can print as much money as we want, and they just stay on our balance sheet as bad debt. More money gets pumped into the system, the dollars lose value. So the Federal Reserve is essentially a Ponzi scheme. Everything is built on debt, and it continues to work only if they continue to print more money. Meanwhile, the value of the dollar continues to decline, and it's not a secret. The Fed openly states that its goal is 2% inflation. In other words, their goal is that you lose 2% of your purchasing power every single year. And that is why Bitcoin is so important. Now, Bitcoin levels the playing field for everyone. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. No more elites, no more special treatment. No one can create more than that. 21 million, that's it. So Bitcoin will forever go up in terms of US dollars by at least the amount of money printing. But here's the thing, it's not just the US that has a Fed. Every major country in the world has its own Fed doing the exact same thing. Every nation is printing money. Bitcoin has a fixed supply. If you want to retain your purchasing power, then you should be saving every extra dollar you have in Bitcoin. It has been the best asset class for the last 10 years. Why? A fixed supply against the expanding amount of global currency means that the price has to go up. That's why the elites who understand this stuff are quietly buying as much Bitcoin as they can before everyday Americans figure it out. If you don't understand Bitcoin but you want to, I have a Skool community with video trainings and content to help you understand so that you don't miss out on this once in a lifetime opportunity. The link is in the description below. I'll see you there.